Here I've got paths from RYO, a great 4-in and 4-out switch with CV or clock-based switching with forward and reverse modes, which you can use and mix together at the same time, as well as a reset and a hold along with manual buttons or CV control. Here's the 4 inputs taking 4 different waves, which are sawtooth, shark fin, triangle and square waves. I'm then taking the first output into the opto disc, which is there for some volume control, and I'm going to fuzz up the sounds a little bit with some saturation. I've got the clock going into the forward motion input, and you can see this cycling through the 4 outputs and rotating which input goes to which output. Taking that out, I can use the buttons to go forward, or use the reverse button. Plug the clock back in and put in the reverse input. We've also got the reset button. And there's also a hold. Patching in a square wave LFO into the hold, we can hold the output regardless of that clock input. This works in the reset as well. So the hold and reset and the forward and reverse inputs can all be used at once for more complex switching. Taking these out, we've now got that constant switching again, and we can have just 2 steps, which will go reverse or forward. 3 steps. And then 4 steps. I'm going to add some drive to that opto disc with a gain just to fuzz these up a little and get some general glue and tone applied across those waves. Instead of using a clock at the input, we can actually use CV to switch this. So I'm going to take the clock into the VC sequencer next to it and then flick paths into CV control, and then take the sequencer out into the forward in, and the graphic on the forward input shows how the negative signals will be ignored, which is half wave rectification. Turning steps negative on the sequencer, you can see how these are ignored. So we can create a sequence and create switching based around those sequencer steps. And just to take the patch a bit further, I'll add an envelope to the opto disc for some movement in the sound. Rather than using the 4 inputs to 1 output, I'll look at taking 1 input to the 4 different outputs, but you can use all 4 ins and all 4 outs at the same time, which I'll do later in the video. At the minute, I'm using a clocked envelope and the actual envelope out to create the switching. This is just like a clock but with an actual envelope shape, and I'm going to use this to also strike some low pass gates. I've got 4 different oscillators all tuned to 4 different notes going into their own channel on a quad low pass gate module. The blue stackables are then sending the input to the CV on each of the low pass gates. So I'll take a copy of the signal I'm using to switch the devices, which is that clocked sharp envelope, and I'll use that as an input to the switch as well. So I've got 1 sharp envelope which is used to switch pass forward, and this is also being sent to the low pass gates to open up my sounds. We can reverse that and change the step length. Let's take an unsynced clock source and take that into the reverse input as well, and we can mix the forward and reverse motion. I'll take some unsynced sample and hold modulation and take this into the hold signal. Because the sample and hold is a varying signal level, we'll only get the module holding this switch when the signal is high enough to do so. Here's adding that to the reset. So that's taking one input to 4 different outs. Instead of a straight clock, I've got a rhythmic pulse triggering the forward motion. You can see this is in clock mode and it's moving through the steps. I've got the 4 outputs going into control inputs on elements from mutable instruments. The same clock that's triggering the movement on paths is also triggering the sound on elements. I've got some sample and hold CV which I'll use as an input and let that cycle through the different outputs to control different parts of the elements module. This will be more obvious if I stop paths actually switching and go through the outputs manually. So here it's moving the reverb and the space on elements. That's the dampening and the note length. Here's the brightness control and the geometry, which changes the material that elements is modelling. So adding that switch movement again, this will cycle through and pass that modulation onto the different CV inputs on elements. Taking the pulse out of the switch and going into voltage control mode, I'm also going to take the same sample and hold signal that's my input to actually control the switching. I'll be using the reverse input as the graphic on the module shows that the input wave is fully rectified, meaning any negative signals from that sample and hold will be inverted to be positive and these will still be used rather than ignored. Paths is great for CV switching your modulation, which can be directly linked to the modulation you're actually using as an input to send that around a patch. So here's a more complex patch with 4 ins and 4 outs, and I've got 4 oscillators with 2 mixed and taken to one filter panned left and the other 2 taken to another filter and panned right. Both filters are completely open for now and the 4 inputs to paths are 4 different sequences. One is 16 steps and the other 3 are 8 steps. And then these are going to the 4 outputs with those grey cables taking the sequences to each of the 4 oscillators. And I can rotate around the inputs and the outputs and change which oscillator receives which sequence. So here's one of the oscillators and the sequences. Make sure you're listening in stereo for this, and if I flick through the steps on the paths you'll hear this sequence changes. So there's the different sequences. Each sequence is based on notes in a minor 7 chord, so it stays fairly harmonious between the 4 sequences and the oscillators when we add those up. Turning up the oscillator that's panned right now. So that's 2 oscillators, one left and one right. Let's switch through the sequences again. And then I'll add the other 2 oscillators, so we've got 2 on each side. I'm going to turn down the filter now on the left side, and then the right. This rich detuned sound that's really thick and full, and I'm going to add an envelope to modulate the filter that's panned to the left. And that same envelope to control the filter that's panned right. I'll flick through these sequences again, which will be less obvious now we've got that big sound under control. different sequences are moving through the oscillators and therefore swapping through the left and the right sides of the stereo sound. So hopefully this comes across properly if you watch the video in high quality on YouTube and use headphones or some decent speakers. You're currently listening to braids, and I've got the pressure points modules used to control the mode, the colour and the timbre of braids with its 3 rows of values. Each row is an input to paths and the outputs are going to braids. At the minute the switch isn't doing anything other than passing the signals through, so here's what I've got going on each step of the pressure points. If I take the touch gate out of the brains and pressure points modules, we'll send a gate out every time I touch the pressure point, and I can use this to move through the 3 channels of switching on paths. So I'm using the same set of values per step, but the paths now rotate which set of values is going to which output, adding more variation to the patch. So I'll play around with this noisy droning sort of patch so you can see and hear how it changes. So that's it for paths from RYO, a great switch that goes beyond the usual bi-directional sequential switch that offers 1 input to 4 outputs or 4 inputs to 1 output. You can have 4 inputs rotate around 4 outputs at the same time with a reset and the hold, as well as forward and reverse clocking modes and CV control. As always, hit like and subscribe for more videos every week, and check the Patreon link in the description to see how you can support my channel.